Hello, everyone. This is Dan Sandhu again with the next episode of In Conversation With. This time it's in partnership with the EdTech Evidence Group. I am the CEO of Sparks Learning, but also happen to be a founder of the EdTech Evidence Group, so it really makes sense to bring together some commentators and operators and investors in the education space and get their opinions about education, EdTech, and the impact of evidence and the value that evidence brings in driving great outcomes and performance in education. Welcome to the guests. I'm going to ask them briefly to introduce themselves before we get into some Q&A. Ian.
Thank you, Dan. My name's Ian Coxfold. I am the Head of Education Strategy and Corporate Development at Supporting Education Group, which is a leading provider of school operations, teacher development and tutoring and recruitment services to schools.
Morning, Dan. I'm Louise Mayer, Director of Marketing at Sparks Learning.
Thanks, Dan. I'm Alexander Yossard. I'm a policy lead for digital government at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change.
Morning, Dan. Ian Rowe from the Access Group. I'm head of sales for the classroom division, formerly headed up at GCSE Pod, which was acquired recently.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. It's a great collection of players in the market, from investors, operators, policy think tank, and marketing and sales representatives. Education has clearly, and EdTech particularly, has gone through a major change in the last few years, not necessarily just because of COVID, but the adoption of technology and the demands of the schools and the learners of what they require and how they evidence what a good outcome is. And that's really sort of the nub of the discussion in terms of how we understand what value that evidence has for the users, for the investors in some cases, but also for the operators in terms of how they articulate those propositions to make them more palatable with the market. Ian, first, straight off with you, in the context of acquiring new companies, because that's sort of your pedigree and background, what value do you place on sort of strong outcome-based evidence?
So I feel very lucky to work in education, where there's such a strong link between our main day-to-day business and that kind of impact and social good. And I think investors, including us, understand very clearly that the best way to ensure that a business is long-term sustainable is to ensure that, though that impact is delivered, and you can either measure it through customer satisfaction and net promoter score and retention and so on and so forth, or you can go underneath that and sort of start thinking about how, what the mechanism is of that delivery and how the impact relates to the aspirations of different stakeholders. A classroom teacher will have different concerns than a head teacher, than a mat leader. But so I think all investors sort of look for that. The question is, how far do you go down into the sort of the mechanism rather than just the current state and the outcome?
Yeah. In terms of when you're looking at, because you obviously, I've known you for many years and you've looked at so many companies in the sector over the last 10, 15 years. Do you think those companies, either seeking investment or looking to be acquired, use this as merely a ploy, or are they really interested in it? I mean, how do you identify those entrepreneurs that really are impact driven, if you know what I mean?
So that's a really interesting question. And I think, there is an element of, ESG greenwashing that goes on in the wider sector. And there's nothing sinister in that.
Yeah.
That's just a manifestation of the fact that the minimum expectations for corporate responsibility continue to develop.
Yeah.
And some people are ahead of that curve, some people are behind that curve, some people are doing it from altruism, some from enlightened self-interest.
Yeah.
I think in education, I have never seen a long-term sustainable business that doesn't balance profitability with impact. And, certainly, and as you know, there's a bunch of private equity-owned businesses in education, and we are one of them.
Yeah.
And, our investor shares our view of that, which is, in the long run, our success comes from delivering success.
Yeah.
And actually, the interesting bit then is how you measure that. And we look to measure our impact on learners, on educators, on schools, and on the wider ecosystem.
Yeah.
But it's tricky, and there's no magic answer. It's really hard to really work out what the impact is of, great finance advisory to a school, how's on the learner? Is it being low cost so you can spend more money on teachers?
Yeah.
Or is it managing the budget really tightly so that the head teacher or the mat leader can run a tighter, better, more culturally cohesive school. That is an ongoing quest, an ongoing mission for us and for many others.
Okay, that makes sense, and I think it is a challenge. Yeah, thanks for that, Ian. I think that really makes sense. And I think we'll come back to that later in terms of how the investors are behaving in the market. Louise, from an evidence perspective, you and I have obviously worked together for many years, and we were really part of the whole process of setting the EdTech Evidence Group. But how do we look at evidence as not just a marketing tool, but something more significant in the industry?
I think I'd make a couple of points to that, really. I think in the first instance, it's on us as providers to make sure that the claims that we're making and the statements that we're putting out there on our websites and in our marketing materials and all our collateral are as truthful as they can be and as well evidenced as they can possibly be. I think we all know, big numbers sell, and if you look at all, any other sector, you'll see that organisations use those big numbers to attract buyers. But actually, what is the evidence that's sitting behind those numbers, and and providing the evidence of those is just really, really fundamentally important. I saw an example actually of a provider only last week, and it was an EdTech company that was claiming to be, I think, the UK's largest learning and teaching platform. And that's a great claim to make, isn't it? It sounds amazing.
Yeah.
It sounds super appealing, but actually it wasn't there was no evidence to support that. And probably, to coin one of your phrases, Dave, Dan, show me the evidence about that. So in the first instance, it's up to us. The organisations like the Advertising Standards Authority, they're not going to come after EdTechs. They're not interested at that level. You need to have lots and lots of people writing into the Advertising Standards Authority to question some of the claims that people make. So that's not going to happen. It's up to us to self-regulate that, if you like. But I think on the other hand, it's also up to schools to challenge more and to ask questions and to really get under the skin of the evidence that providers have, and to ask how it's going to impact their school. And that's at all levels. That's schools, that's the teachers, that's the senior leads. They all need to understand what the organisation is claiming to be able to do. Because at the end of the day, we're not selling KitchenAids or hi-fis or something like that. We are selling something that fundamentally has an impact on, that might be an impact on children. It might be an impact on teachers, because it might be a product that actually reduces workload for teachers. So, it's really important that schools understand what that product is actually going to deliver.
Yeah.
So, if I'm a teacher, what am I going to do when I'm looking at an EdTech product? I'm going to, obviously, I need to understand what problem it's trying to solve in my school. I need to know whether it's going to be part of a broader digital strategy and how it contributes to that. I need to have looked at all of the other options available. I need to have seen what's out there in the marketplace. And then I need to say, okay, out of all of those, I'm making this choice, or I want to look more deeply into this organisation. Show me how you are going to have an impact, as I say, whether that's on teacher workload or on children's outcomes or whatever. Ask the questions. How many stands have we been on, Dan, over the years where actually, we as an organisation have done randomised control trials. And when I joined Sparks 4 years ago, I thought, I must get to the bottom of that. Absolutely have to understand this, because I'm going to be challenged over this. People are going to want to know about the outcomes. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I have ever been asked by a teacher to explain more about our RCTs.
Yeah.
And they should be asking those questions. We invest in that evidence, and it's important.
I think it's really important. I think when I had that epiphany on stage and set up the EdTech Evidence Group on the back of listening to too many smoke and mirror arguments, I think that was the basis of it. I think people really forget that sometimes it's not even about the money. It's about the time that children could be wasting with a poor product for a year. That time's not coming back. Yeah, exactly. Not only the time, the fact that the EdTech could actually do harm. The assumption that EdTech is either flat or good for somebody negates the fact that it could actually do some damage. It could take learning backwards or expectations backwards from teachers and from students. I'll come back to Louise, and I will pick up a question more about global education in a while. Alex, you've had we've been talking recently about some of the stuff that the Institute's been doing globally. Where does evidence sit in terms of providing statistical evidence of outcomes in the global arena? Is there an acceptance of it, and how important is it for those learning platforms?
It's crucial. And the reason it's crucial is because at the end of the day, governments care about impact, and they care about impact even more than schools themselves care. Because for them, if they're making policy decisions that are making the ecosystem prepared for better adoption of EdTech products, they need to know that they're not doing harm. They need to know that the money they are ultimately spending, even if it's through the schools, they're getting value for money, and governments care about that. Something I think we tend to forget is that EdTech is GovTech. EdTech is being sold to governments. And therefore, founders and companies need to understand what the government's priorities are. Now, if you look around the world today, you can see that learning is in crisis. And that's obviously not news to anyone here. I don't think we'd be working in this space if we didn't think so. But post-COVID, the World Bank has found that learning poverty, which is a measure of young children who can't read or understand a simple text, has gone up from 50%, which is where it was in 2019, to 70% today globally. So 70% of young children can't read or understand a simple text that's appropriate for their age. Governments are very aware that this is an issue. But at the end of the day, education policy is governed by this trilemma of scale, quality, and cost. And the way that systems are designed today, they are failing to combine all three. So where technology comes in is in its potential to do in education what it's done in other industries, which is help to deliver quality education at scale at sustainable cost. But what governments really need to know then is that whatever products they're engaging with can deliver that quality.
I think that's really important, and I've always felt sometimes governments, and I'm totally apolitical as everyone knows, so I'm not going to make any political statements. Education is a nation building tool, and governments around the world sometimes fail to recognize what the impact in the 10, 20, 50-year cycle is for education. And if you look back over the last 50 years of those countries that had strong educational policies 30, 40 years ago, that reflects in their economies right now. And for that, I think evidence is important. Well, we'll come back and talk a bit more about international shortly. Ian, we're on the EEG board together, and you've been a real major player in the EdTech world for many years. What role do you think the EEG itself plays in the EdTech ecosystem in the UK?
I think there's a huge role to play. I think just a bit of context. I mean, we're all feeling the pinch already with the sort of increasing utility prices. You couple that with increased wage bills in schools, no money to cover it. Schools are probably facing deficits in the regions of sort of hundreds of thousands of pounds, and there's no sign of money coming into the system to do that. They need their back office systems. They need their electricity. They need their management information system. They need all of that kind of tech to stay open. And we're finding through the Access Group that schools are starting to consolidate those kind of resources to get them all into one place and sort of make some sort of efficiencies in terms of savings and time. But sadly, what that leaves then is very, very little money left in the system to speculate and try other products, to see what's out there. And schools really need to know what works, and that's where the EEG comes in. So obviously we're a community that work really, really closely together. We mentor and support each other, and the one sole aim is to drive the standards of evidence that's being provided to schools. And Louise touched on it. We'll not have an EEG member that will go out there and bamboozle schools with their marketing materials and weird and wacky claims. We'll support our members to gather evidence, to be able to present that evidence in a robust fashion that can be challenged, and then schools trust us. And we're already seeing that the sort of the EEG logo is almost being recognised as kind of as a kite mark, and as a symbol that to school leaders that what we're dealing with here is a quality organisation that has got substance behind their products. And it's no surprise at the moment. We've got a huge number of applicants looking to join the EEG across, from all sorts of different areas to get into, because they see the value of that and they want the expertise. They want to work with other members within the EEG to learn from us, and I think that's part of what we're doing. So if there's anybody watching this today that is looking to join, please reach out to us. If you've got the same sort of mindset as us, we'll be really keen to work with you.
Absolutely. I think really proud of where the EEG's come from and what we've achieved at the EEG, and support from them, like Amazon Web Services and Wanda's been really helpful. And I think what EEG has managed to put in place is a structure whereby even EdTech companies, which are nascent and new and starting up, if they need mentoring and support, that's a purpose. I mean, it's very clear. I think people shouldn't be afraid that the EdTech Evidence Group is only for large operators. Even if you're a startup and you need the guidance to be on the route, that's what the schools want to hear. The schools don't necessarily don't expect everyone to be like Sparks, and this is not a promotion. Not everyone has done randomized, double-blind randomized control trials. But if the schools understand that you're on a journey and your methodology has research in it, your pedagogy is research-based, that is a massive plus. And we hear that from companies all the time and schools all the time, not necessarily using Sparks, but other products in the market.
Well, I've been mentoring Synaptic that just joined recently, and it's like, where do we start with this? How do we go about gathering that evidence?
Synaptic's a great team, and a little plug for Synaptic. They're a great team, and they're really opening up to saying, what evidence how do we go down the route of generating evidence which will satisfy ourselves first before we satisfy the schools?
Yeah, I agree.
Brilliant. Ian, we talked earlier about greenwashing from an entrepreneur's perspective. Where are the investors at? The whole ECG world, and where do the LPs and the top level investors who are looking at the family offices? I mean, going as far away as possible from, in effect, where the hard work happens. Not that the family offices don't do hard work, but where are they at in terms of evidence and impact? Now, the context, I was talking to some family offices in Switzerland recently, and they're really interested, and they want to become part of the EEG in the UK, because for them it was almost trying to put a discipline in place for their portfolio. The same applies to some portfolios in the UK, where they want to use that almost as the kite market is probably wrong for them, but a gatepost to go through to either validate that they should invest and or have appropriate KPIs. And I know there are some private equity funds who have published their metrics with the kind of impact KPIs as part of the metrics.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. And so, where are the investors on this? So like I said, there's a journey, and some are, beginning that journey, and some are well advanced on it. For some, it's a point of differentiation, and you won't be surprised that they take it more seriously. I think that where you get real diligence applied is where the money, is where it sort of intersects with money. So it is possible to get cheaper debt by guaranteeing to hit as a business a bunch of ESG and impact metrics. Obviously, those debt providers, who are securing, lower interest rates, from their backers, will ask you to demonstrate that. It is possible to see higher valuations from an impact investor or a family office, but they will then, to justify that, they will ask you to demonstrate it. We had one of the big four financial professional advisors in a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about their services to diligence impact claims. And it's a small team, and tends to be pretty focused work, but that's beginning to be a thing, is impact DD or ESG DD. Because if you're going to ask for an extra half turn, 1 turn, 2 turns on or EBITDA, the investor is going to want to know that that's real.
What about I've always I've never been on that side of the table, but it takes a while in education to show a return. So it's not a 2-3 year flip. Are the hold periods, a technical term, the hold periods for investors longer now in education, or are they still trying to build companies, flip them quickly, or are they accepting the fact that it could take 5-7 years?
So if you're I hear what I know what you're saying around sort of it takes a while to get a business established.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think there is an understanding and acceptance in the investor community that different stages of an organization's life cycle will take a different amount of time.
Yeah.
However, I would say that the hold periods are not very different
Okay.
to other sectors.
Okay.
I think the consideration time frame
Yeah.
can be a lot longer. So
Okay.
investors will be thinking about what's
Yeah.
going to happen 5, 7, 10, 12 years.
Yeah.
A conversation yesterday about, what will the investor in 10 years' time,
Yeah.
be worried about, and how will we,
Okay.
how can we begin to prepare for that by putting in the sort of, the new seedlings now that will actually be showing impact by then. We hope to show impact.
Yeah.
faster.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think all of these programs, they're not all in lockstep. Some initiatives, some new products are coming to maturity and have been at maturity for long enough to really show impact, while others are in their earlier stages and just getting to market. And actually, your randomized, double-blind control trials, just won't exist for another couple of years.
Yeah.
So I think to run a business well in this space, you just have to look ahead and work backwards from that, and make sure you're collecting the data you're going to need before you need it.
That's so true. And I was with some EdTech entrepreneurs and investors last night. And I think the theme there was definitely collect the data now, start talking and socializing that data and those metrics way ahead of funding or kind of an exit process. So you're actually building the expectation in the market and being very honest with your progress.
I think that's exactly it. And also, and I think this is really important, something we take really seriously, once you have that data set, yes, you improve the quality of the data and all the rest of it, but actually you can begin to show an investor or a customer or our team, because actually, one of the sort of big reasons we pursue a sort of demonstration of our impact is it fires up our team. We've got about 1,200 people, the vast majority of whom are absolutely passionate about having an impact. So, for us, the business to do a good job, we all feel it.
Yeah.
But on the investor front, once you've got that data and you can show it, you can show how you have the sort of processes and governance to consistently improve it.
Okay.
And that sort of feedback cycle from collecting data, analyzing data, identifying opportunities to improvement, embedding those opportunities, and then collecting the new data and showing that sort of conscious, deliberate self-improvement cycle, that's really powerful for impact, as it is in every other aspect of business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes such a difference. And I think I've seen in my journey in EdTech over the last 15 years an evolution in the understanding from the investor community of what's required and how, to my mind at least, evidence drives sustainability, drives profitability, drives commercial success, and getting that the right way around, tied up with outcomes, makes such a joined up thinking from impact-centric entrepreneurs and increasingly, and I think very encouragingly, impact-centric investors, both at the kind of direct investment ready level, but also at the family offices who in the past sort of did that more philanthropically rather than through investment vehicle.
Do you know, actually, one thing that's, I think, really interesting, and one thing that's really important is it isn't a big bang.
Yeah.
It's in stages.
Yeah.
So, the level of evidence, and you'll have seen this, Louise, as much as anybody, you can start with, articulating how any particular product will have impact. And then you can collect some case studies around that and show that it has that impact in some cases. And then you can show that on average it has that impact. And then there's another stage beyond that where you actually begin to see the impact it's having on each individual user and customer. And if you had to go straight from the start to the finish, that would be terrifying.
Yeah.
But you can build and develop and improve that articulation over time. And that is definitely the process that we are on. And some of our services were well into the sort of third and fourth stage, and others were, moving from the first to the second. I suspect it's true for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Louise, given we've talked about EdTech in the UK context, and you've done a fair amount of work in the international arena. How do you think this helps the UK EdTech position itself in international markets?
Well, I think once you've got over the doom and gloom of education globally to start with, and then whatever your perceptions of education in the UK, I actually think that UK EdTech is really well positioned on this one. When actually, if you look at how well respected we are internationally from an education perspective, there are obviously we've got, and that's not just in K-12, but also through FE and HE as well. Students coming to this, international students coming to this country. We've got schools who are taking their UK model and evolving that internationally. We've got teachers, supremely respected British teachers, lots of demand for them in international settings as well. But actually, sort of to the point that you were making earlier, Dan, being able to also link yourself to organisations that have respect globally, people like Cambridge, like Oxford, and other smaller organisations, like, for example, the EEG and so on. All of that, is amazing because they are extremely well-respected brands, for example, in the research space. So to take the RCT, an absolute example of that is we did that trial ourselves. We published an evaluation of it ourselves, and that's fine, but that was us evaluating our own work. The game changer was when we were able to say, actually, this has been evaluated by RAND Europe and by Cambridge, and the difference that made in an international setting was huge. Absolutely huge. And the respect that brand has in that setting is massive. So, we have an amazing heritage in that space, don't we, of organisations, and it's really important to work with those organisations and to use them to provide sort of further backup to that evidence story, I think.
I think I've been very lucky, and I've worked in Canada, Romania, India, Australia in education. And I'm probably taking some of Alex's thunder from my next question, but it's always amazing when you go to one of these conferences anywhere in the world. The Cambridge and Oxford stands are always surrounded, so we do have that pedigree. It's kind of slightly patriotic to say that we've been doing this for 1,000 years and we've kind of made all the mistakes you could possibly make in 1,000 years, and so we've probably done everything a few times over before other nations have even started. So I think in that respect, I think there is pedigree. You can always slip. You've got to make sure you don't stay complacent. But I think that evidence angle really helps. I've been talking to the EdTech Evidence ecosystem in North America, and very similar dynamics there, and where schools are now demanding more evidence coming through. Alex, sorry, a slight repetition of the same question in terms of, the UK is doing really well. Education, I personally feel, has got to be one of our most important exports from a moral perspective, let alone an economic perspective. Where do you think the opportunities are in global education for UK education and EdTech businesses?
I think ultimately, obviously, it will depend on the business very much, and there's no one size fits all. And I think what Louise said about the reputation that we have globally is really key here, because whatever market you consider the best fit for you, you're coming into with an advantage. As long as you are focused, as long as you are strategic about it, I think you are in a better starting position than many businesses, for a whole range of reasons, including the fact that the UK is a fairly mature edtech market. And I've been doing this for a few years too, and I've heard all sorts of challenges that we all face. But at the end of the day, schools here understand what EdTech is. They are prepared to invest in it. The same goes for government. There are investors who, again, understand that it's not quite the usual, 2 years mega growth and you're done. So you're starting from a strong base and you're starting from a secure position, and that gives you the ability to experiment. That gives you the ability you have more resources coming into this than many of the businesses that are in place, trying to grow globally. But I think, if we talk about what areas are there opportunities in, I think foundational learning is definitely one of them. I wouldn't say it's doom and gloom. I describe this as an exciting challenge, and one that should absolutely drive us with urgency to address it. And now there's an opportunity where governments finally understand just how much of an issue that is, and governments finally are prepared to invest what are often very limited resources out of a very limited pot of resources into EdTech. I think the UK absolutely has the opportunity to lead the way here.
I mean, just so the audience understands, Alex co-authored a report for the Tony Blair Global Institute for Change, which talked very specifically about education technology adoption. Kind enough to give Sparks a shout out, which was very nice of you. But I think, in essence, what the report talked about is there's a long way to go. There's lots of things to do. There's lots of changes, and I know the Institute's working on some really radical proposals for global education. I think that makes a difference, and we need to kind of, we all do kind of, get a bit carried away, I suppose, and it's because it's very personal to us of what's happening in the UK at the moment. But if you look in various territories where there's no technology infrastructure, there's no pedagogy infrastructure, children are being left behind in their millions, there is a lot that we can do as a country to support those. Many years ago, when I started up at Sparks, and I always felt there was a role for UK-based EdTech companies to go out there and support the underdeveloped educational economies by supporting them. And I think that I'm seeing more and more of that in the industry, and I'm hoping that we as Sparks, and I'm sure the same applies to other companies, I want to go out there and make a difference.
Maybe let me add to that quickly to say what our research found was that if we want to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goal 4 of every child in school by 2030, we would need to have 272 million more children in school in the year 2030 than we had in the year 2015.
Yeah.
On current trends, we are nowhere near, and we are likely to fall short at least by 100 million, which is where technology does come in, because this is where you can plug those gaps, where you can deliver quality at cost, at scale, sustainably, but also where the world is waking up to this challenge. So I'm sure you've come across the EdTech Hub, and it's organizations like this that show us the demand for evidence. Going back to your kind of first question to me,
I think it's very relevant, and I know the audience will have lots of EdTech players in there, be it operators or investors, and I think it's very important for us to accept that challenge, and it's a moral obligation for us to help. If technology can drive that adoption, that's got to be good in the long run, and I think. I still believe people are in education to make a difference. I think there's an open challenge there for everyone. Ian, in terms of from a UK perspective and the role that EdTech adoption plays, is it moving? I mean, apart from the COVID blip, has the adoption increased, which will drive more outcomes and improvement in children's education?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the first thing I was going to say is what is EdTech these days? And I can see it from the sort of the diversity in applications that are coming through to EEG. From like automarking sort of free text questions through to sort of teacher recruitment platforms. So it is definitely moving. I mean, we started to see. Sort of pre-COVID and move towards sort of blended learning, and I think it comes down to sort of three key factors to some extent. And sort of Louise referred to it in terms of what need is it that you're trying to sort of satisfy. But there's three key issues facing schools at the moment. Obviously, the first thing is that ultimately they want the best possible outcome for the students, and that goes without saying. They're trying to do it with less staff because, unfortunately, teacher retention is falling off and there's less being recruited than are leaving. So there's a massive shortage of staff within schools. And ultimately, there isn't the money to balance the books coming into the system just now. So in terms of the sort of direction of travel for EdTech, it's things that are going to tick at least 2 or 3 of those boxes. And again, from the first one, in terms of does it work? You've got to have the evidence to prove that your product is actually going to do what it says on the tin, and it's going to make a difference to the outcomes of the students at the end of the day. And again, obviously, a little plug for joining the EEG. I mean, that's obviously one of the most important areas to get into. From a teacher point of view, if there's less staff in the system, you've got to have something that is going to save teachers time. It's not going to add to their workload. It has got to make some kind of efficiency. And I've seen things already like online parents' evenings. Gotta hate them when they switch off literally. You get to the good bit and it's like your time is up. But in terms of the impact that's probably made in school for preparation, for time, all of those kind of things, it's fantastic. Are we going to start to see school trips becoming more sort of virtual reality tours and things like that to get that experience? But most importantly, I think within the sector, we've been talking about data all the way through this. You've got to have interoperability between platforms. Your data has got to live in schools, and they've got to be able to use it to make informed outcomes. And obviously, if you're ticking either of those 2 boxes, schools are going to take a look at your product. You've also then got to make it cost effective, and it's got to have value for money. And I didn't say right at the start into the introduction, my background was actually in clinical research and then pharmaceutical sales before I moved across to education. And I saw the advent of an organisation called NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And that came in, and for new pharmaceuticals coming into the system, that really changed the landscape in terms of there was hoops to jump through in terms of the level of evidence you had to gather. And then more importantly, they actually started to restrict and govern prices as well. So for businesses, it made things quite tough to bring in new products. And I've heard the DfE a few times now start to mention the word NICE in some of their conversations, and I just wonder, in terms of direction of travel, are we going to see something along those kind of lines appearing within the sector at some point?
Oh dear, we don't want to go into a political argument here, but yes, I think the reality is the UK schools are much more accepting of it. I think the evidence really supports. Obviously, the schools have got a very different perspective post-COVID in terms of what outcomes means and how technology can be best adopted. I think it has moved from a nice to have to a must have in most school environments. Yeah. Well, that's been a really interesting discussion, and I think everyone's come from a very different angle, from investment to international markets to policy to schools. And before we finish, I just want everyone to give me probably their one or two words or one or two sentences maybe as a sort of wrap up. Just to kind of any final thoughts you have before we close. But I've got to thank you all. Thanks very much for joining us. And final thoughts, Ian?
I'm going to take a little bit longer than a couple of sentences.
Yeah, go for it.
I think one of the really interesting areas that lies in front of us is around segmentation of schools and their operating models. And when I look at EdTech, and particularly the kind of sort of self-service EdTech, I see a couple of really interesting and challenging trade-offs. One around the risk that it forces schools into sort of converging their model on something that's sort of really closely aligned to a particular solution, and force them to make compromise around the specific needs of specific classes. And there is, I think, in the DfE and elsewhere, an understanding of the economic implications of concentration of providers, and there's tons of power in that in terms of economic power. But you get into this, this trade-off around sort of what's the menu to choose from. So I think there's some really interesting stuff there, and there's some really interesting stuff around, the risk that reliance goes from sort of a subject matter expert to a process.
Okay.
Now, in our work around sort of, back office services, when we look at sort of EdTech, we're really sort of taking the view of tech enabling, i.e. combining the best of, our massive experts in payroll or teacher legal issues or recruitment or whatever it is, with some of the power of digital communications and automation you can get out of technology. But it's really hard to sort of, find that balance of the two. And that balance, ideally needs to be a bit different for different flavors of schools. So one thing that I'd really like to see, more sector leadership on, whether that comes from the EEG or BISA or the DfE itself, is a sort of common language around, how schools and teachers are trying to do different things, so that we can all sort of, I'm sort of tempted to say, be more honest about exactly where our sweet spot, our products and services sweet spot is, and where it is not. And at the moment, we're all sort of reaching for that, but we're all sort of using different language and different methodologies to try and assess that. So I'd love to see, a landscape which would be super complex and very hard to do from any individual provider's perspective.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great consistency.
Sorry, more than two
No,
sentences.
that's okay. But I think it's in summary,
Worthwhile, I think.
consistency, sweet spot with all the ecosystem working together.
Yeah.
Louise?
Well, I won't do another plug for the EEG because Ian's doing
I'm going to finish with that.
Fair enough. No, but I was just going to say that actually I think one of the really great things about EdTech is and the EEG in that same context is the kind of community aspect of what we all do. Yeah. And there are some amazing organisations and there are some amazing people trying to genuinely do good for kids out there and to support teachers as well. And they're really kind of focused on delivering that, and it's not just about kind of making a quick bang for your buck.
Yeah.
And probably actually, if you're trying to do that, you're in the wrong sector, I imagine. So that the community piece of what we do and the real focus on impact for learners, I think, is what makes EdTech really amazing, actually.
Brilliant. So a strong community, we're in it to make a difference.
Yeah.
Alex.
Well, Ian's opened the floodgate, so I might take a few more sentences than just two. Just to pick up on Louisa's point, I think that the community is absolutely amazing. In the UK, globally, people are really putting in the effort to change things for the better. What we want to see is their efforts scaling up and going beyond just the few early adopters, just the kind of 20% of people who really understand what this is about, for tech to become an integral part of education systems. What unfortunately has tended to happen so far is that governments have treated EdTech as something that you kind of sprinkle on top of the education system, whether that's schools or universities, then you hope for the better, maybe add some devices, maybe add some software. But there hasn't been a lot of thinking around what does an education system look like when technology runs through it as a golden thread. This is what we at the Institute call Tech Inclusive Education Policy. Dan very kindly has tried me to get to mention some of our reports. So, do look us up and see our work on education around what does Tech Inclusive Policy look like.
Brilliant. So it's about systematic tech engagement, not a sprinkling on top. And absolutely, that's great. Ian.
I think what's evidence is going to be key, and gathering that evidence. And again, it is a plug for the EG, and it is a community of people that are passionate about making a difference to outcomes for students, but have also got experience in terms, to get a randomised controlled clinical trial within the education sector takes some doing, and hats off to the guys at Sparks for that. But there is a wealth of experience in terms of supporting companies to gather all those levels of data. And that is what I think we're going to need in this sector to convince schools if they're going to invest their money, this is going to work for them.
Brilliant, thank you. That was a great roundup, and from your perspective, evidence is at the core of it, and that sort of sums up what we've been talking about. Well, thank you everyone for joining me today, Ian, Alex, Louise, Ian. I think that's been really helpful in terms of moving the conversation forward around evidence. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll come back again with another In Conversation With in a few weeks' time, but for the meantime, thank you.